One of the saddest things to encounter is to find a priest, for example, who no longer believes in his own vocation, specifically who has serious reservations about the power that the sacrament of holy orders gives him to change the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. The very first bad priest, so to speak, who was a man who was at the Last Supper, talking, of course, about Judas Iscariot. It seems that, according to John chapter 6, and you can finish reading the rest of it at home, that it was right after Jesus taught about eating his body and drinking his blood. And this was about 1 year before the Last Supper that Judas became disillusioned with him. Possibly he was disillusioned with Jesus for other reasons also, but it seems that there's a connection there with his unwillingness to accept these words of Jesus, which are immortalized in the sacred text about eating his body and drinking his blood. Jesus is very graphic in what he says. It's lost in the English. The English language uses the word eat. E-A-T is the standard verb. We have other verbs that we don't usually use about consuming food, such as gnaw, G-N-A-W. But that's the word that is used in the Greek, which is the original language for the New Testament, gnawing and devouring his body and blood. Now, why would such graphic language be used? The reason it's used is because St. John, who wrote this down, wanted to make it very clear that Jesus was not speaking symbolically. He was talking about something that we really have to take at its face value. And we also see this in the fact that besides Judas Iscariot, many other people became disillusioned with Jesus. They could not deal with eating his body and drinking his blood. And we can understand that in the sense that the Jews, even to this day, are not supposed to ingest blood. I mean, if they have any sort of meat products, the products have to be untainted by any blood. So Jesus was really very provocative. We have the expression today, pushing the envelope. That's exactly what he did. I mean, we can see why Jesus was crucified. I mean, he said some things that were very powerful. One of the problems today is that too many people seemingly don't have that shock or any sort of passionate response to what Jesus said, because maybe they've heard things before, they don't really understand what Jesus said. But we have to understand what he said, and if things affect us, if he said something that really touches us at a deep level, it means that we've heard it. And that may mean for some people, perhaps many years before they hear something. The Catholic Church has always taught the reality of the Eucharist as being the body and blood of Jesus. Interestingly enough, though, over the centuries, other people have called into question this teaching. A man named John Wycliffe, who was a Catholic priest, he was born in 1330. He was educated, a very educated man. He was a professor at Oxford. In those days, the only professors were Catholic clerics. I mean, the Catholic Church started the university system. There were no such things as state colleges or state-run universities or secular universities. They were all connected with the church. But John Wycliffe had some real problems with the church's teaching about the Eucharist. In fact, he claimed that to say that Jesus gives us his body and blood and that the priest consecrates the host and the wine and these things turn into his body and blood, according to John Wycliffe, is a novelty. It was never really the belief of the church in the very beginning. Well, I'm here to tell you that it always has been the belief of the church. I mean, granted, there were some vocabulary that developed later and other practices that developed later, but from the earliest times in the history of the church, people believed that what Jesus said we must take seriously. And he believed in the power of the priest to transform the elements into the body and blood of Christ. One example among several, St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was a bishop, Antioch being in Syria, and again I would remind everybody to pray for the Syrians. But St. Ignatius was arrested because he was a practicing Catholic. He was also a leader in the church. It was against the law for people to be living the Catholic faith in the Roman Empire for the first 300 years. So Ignatius was arrested, and he was escorted by armed guards. He was chained, and they took him from Antioch to Rome. It was a long walk, but this is apparently how they traveled. During his walk, he had periods of rest where he wrote letters. He wrote 7 letters to various churches, meaning the church located in different cities. In fact, you can go to a library or on the internet, look up St. Ignatius of Antioch, and read his letters. Nobody disputes the authenticity of his letters. I mean, they're legitimate letters. We know at that time, and again, he died in 117, there was a threefold hierarchy: bishop, priest, and deacon. There was a pope in Rome, and Ignatius himself called the Eucharist the medicine of immortality. A mere piece of bread cannot be the medicine of immortality. He also looked forward to his own death. He was sentenced to being devoured by wild animals. He associated his death with the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross that's present in the Mass, and all of these things. He was very dedicated to the mission of the church, and he believed very much in what his vocation was as a priest and as a bishop, to bring the body and blood of Jesus to the people. The first daily communicative in the history of the church, arguably, is a woman named St. Monica. We have a picture of her in the gathering area on stained glass. St. Monica, when she was dying, she was in bed, and 2 of her sons were discussing among themselves where the mother should be buried. Now, the mother wasn't yet dead, but she was dying. And they were discussing it because they were not in their homeland, and one of them was worried that she really ought to be buried back home. And so at one point, Monica said, "Look, sons, don't be so concerned about where you bury this poor body of mine, but do me this one good turn. Remember me at the altar," meaning celebrate Mass for my intentions when I'm deceased. And again, she would never have said something like that if all she believed was that the priest offered a piece of bread, and that's all the Eucharist is. And one of her sons eventually converted. He became a priest himself and a bishop. We call him St. Augustine. And Augustine, perhaps more than anybody in the early church, and this is going into the 5th century, he had the most brilliant exposition of the doctrine of the Holy Eucharist. If you read anything of St. Augustine, he was a genius, a profound genius. Look into something about him. I mean, a real gift from God, people of this type. St. Francis, again, many people associate him with being a lover of nature and so forth, and he was, but not for the sake of loving nature. He loved the things that God made, because he recognized these are creatures of God. But St. Francis was very much a man of the church. He worked closely with the Pope. And one of the last things he wrote before he died to his friars, and this is in the 13th century, was that the Blessed Sacrament should be properly positioned in the tabernacle in a place of dignity, and not to forget to do that. He himself had a great devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, as Franciscans still do today. His spiritual sister, St. Clare, who became a cloistered nun herself, the classic scene where there was an army ready to invade Assisi, which was where her convent was. So she took the Blessed Sacrament and held it up, and something happened to the army. They fled in fear. It was a miraculous intervention of God through the Eucharist to preserve Assisi from being sacked by this invading army. In those days, for example, in Europe, there were all kinds of principalities and kingdoms, and many of them were always fighting with each other, so this is what we're dealing with. But it was the Blessed Sacrament's power, and she knew about it, that fended off this army. Finally, another woman comes to mind. I've been to her city, which is York, England. Her name was Margaret Clitheroe. She's now St. Margaret Clitheroe. I wish she were on our calendar in this country, but she isn't. But Margaret Clitheroe never set foot in the Catholic Church in her life. But she ended up being a witness to the power and the presence of God in the Eucharist and the validity of the Catholic priesthood. In England in those days, it was illegal to practice the Catholic faith. Queen Elizabeth cracked down on the church. She fined anybody who would not attend the official Protestant services. So Catholic priests were on the run. If they wanted to celebrate Mass, they had to do it in private homes because all the churches had been confiscated. To this day, the original Catholic churches in England are not owned by the Catholic Church anymore. And if you go to England, there are many manor houses there that have secret rooms that were built to hide the priests during this terrible era of penalization for anybody who practiced Catholicism that way. In fact, the priests were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, and many of them were if they were caught. Margaret Clitheroe was so impressed with the witness of these priests that she took Catholic instructions and became a Catholic herself. And she would bring priests to her home so she could go to Mass. She wanted the real body and blood of Christ, not the official state service where there was no consecration of the elements. Well, someone turned her into the authorities. She went to jail. She did not recant, although she knew that if she would recant, they would let her go. She'd be free. She could do what she wanted to do. But she would not do that because she would not go against her conscience. So she was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, but she refused to go to trial because she hadn't, in her mind, and which was true, she hadn't done anything wrong. So the penalty for not going to trial was to be pressed to death by weights. So she had to lay down on the ground and put a door on top of her and crushed to death with all this weight. Margaret Clitheroe. She had several children, and there was at least one priestly vocation and a couple of religious vocations among her children. So the Catholic Church has always upheld and defended and lived and celebrated and believed in what Jesus teaches. The thing is, we're always close, if we're not careful, to losing our faith. There are people who leave the church every day, which is unfortunate, throughout the world. We have to know what we have as Catholics. We have to treasure it. We have to cherish it. We have to live our faith. Pray before the Blessed Sacrament. And the priest holds the host up at Mass in the chalice. Use it as a time of veneration. Always receive communion in a state of grace. If a person is aware that he has committed a serious sin, an individual really needs to go to confession before coming up to communion, because otherwise that would be a great disrespect to the body and blood of Jesus. Everyone should receive properly. Most people do, although sometimes I see people take the host back to their seats. That is not permitted. I always get worried when I see that. And strangely enough, it's usually older people who do that. So please be very mindful. If you take communion in the hand, which is legitimate, do it in the right way and ingest the host right when you're still, you take one step to the side and ingest the host. Don't bring the host back to your seat. A few weeks ago, a woman tried to take a host out of the church. A consecrated host. Very serious. I don't think she knew what she was doing, which is another issue. But that would have been a sacrilege. Sacrilege is a violation of the sacred thing. So it's not bread we're dealing with. If it were only bread, you could take it out, you could take it home, you could do what you want with it. But this is the sacred species, the body and blood of Jesus. It's Jesus himself. I'm not saying Jesus isn't present anywhere else. Yes, he talks to us in the Scriptures. He's present in the church community. That is true. But he's not present in his body and blood in that respect as he is in the Blessed Sacrament. So, and finally, to live what we believe. It's a counter witness for Catholics who go to church on a regular basis. I'm not accusing anybody. I'm just making a statement here. To go to church on a regular basis and not live their faith outside the church. It really hurts. And so other people look at that and say, well, why should I come into the church? Or why should I be interested in the Catholic faith? Because I know Catholics and they're no different from anyone else. Don't be afraid to be different. We have to be different. Not for the sake of being different, but to be like Jesus. The world is extremely secular. And if we're not different from the world, it probably means we're like the world in too many ways, and that we're not living, breathing examples for people of another way to live, the way of God. the way of Jesus.